Parsley, sage, rosemary, and thyme. Whenever spring water or a drop of rain fell, and then she'll be true love of mine. Tell her to try it on a yonder thorn. Parsley, sage, rosemary, and thyme. That never bore blossom since Adam was born, and then she'll be true love of mine. Are you going to Scarborough Fair? Parsley, sage, rosemary, and thyme. Remember me to one who lived there, for she once was a true love of
I want to thank you all for joining the presentation today. With COVID restrictions, it's a joy just to talk and see new faces and to visit with my friends in Western Kentucky. I had to go to a neighbor's house this morning, even though I live in the metropolitan Louisville area. That does not mean that we have easy access to internet. So if I have an unstable recording today, I apologize. I'm on 5G, but sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But I'm just thrilled to be invited and to be part of the award-winning journal. I'm so proud of the Jackson Purchase Historical Society. You all are rocking it out the park, and we're just, I really appreciate being part of this organization. I don't know about you, but during COVID, I've done a lot of eating, a lot of cooking, a lot of eating, and that just seemed an appropriate topic for this time of year. So the presentation today is about some of our foodways of Kentucky. And I have to say, I love to cook. I'm not much of a baker, and I'll share a little more about that as we go through the presentation today. But that's a picture of my husband and my youngest son there. My husband, I have to admit, is as good, if not better, a cook than I am. And so that's a nice treat for me, but it is, I have to say, we have eaten a lot during COVID. But I grew up with a lot of family members that loved good food and good eats, and we often came together as family. With several generations coming together with our cousins to visit with one another. And that was a real blessing for me as I was growing up in Western Kentucky. And I'm going to be curious after we get through this presentation. I'd like to hear from you all in terms of what foods are, ring a bell as for you as going through this presentation, because our foods came through so many different avenues all across the world. But for myself, my interest in learning more about our food culture came about because of my mom and I wanted to do a cookbook together. And we talked about it for a long time and never had done anything about it until around 2000. When my grandmother passed away, my dad's mom, and mother was helping clean out her kitchen, and she came across this little notebook that you see there on the left. And it was just a little, simple flip top notebook with lined pages. And she noticed on the cover, it's almost invisible now, but the cover has my granny's name, which was Bobbie Smith, and it had KHS initials. And that was from Kirksey High School, and it was 1930, and she would have been 15 years old. And as mom was flipping through the pages, she realized that these were the handwritten recipes that she was writing down as she was learning to cook from her mother and her grandmother. And so it really was the impetus that helped push us towards publishing my second book, which is Passions of the Black Patch, Cooking and Quilting in Western Kentucky. And the cookbook has not only about 200 recipes, but we also, my brother and I have inherited about 22, 23 quilts between the two of us. And so I also do a small section in the book that is a tribute to the quilters as well as the cooks. And it was just the talents of these people and from my ancestry that I admire so much and that have been passed on to me. And then also part of the cookbook, there's about 50 stories, just little vignette stories about the culture of Western Kentucky. But in my early life, and my ancestors actually came originally from Germany down into the North Carolina Piedmont area. And in the early 1820s, they received land grants that moved them then into what has become now the Jackson Purchase. And one of the most appealing aspects of the area that we call Kentucky, all across the state, is the land. If you remember, most early pioneers wrote reverently about the mystical draw of Kentucky. It was a land that was flowing with milk and honey. There was abundant game and lush pastures and fresh water. And so, of course, the fruits of nature they're just there for the taking. And for our family, the beauty was really within the land that they could grow their crops. And for our family in particular, that crop was tobacco, and that's a dark tobacco that's growing there in the field. Now, you all know this because of your passion for the Jackson Purchase, but as I've given this presentation across the state, I do have several slides that I've taken out for today just because I know you all are familiar, but I do try to share some of the heritage of Western Kentucky and specifically the Jackson Purchase because so few people in Kentucky really know that much about this part of the state. But back in the late 17 and early 1800s, Kentucky across the land was a beehive of activity. The earliest European settlements occurred by 1774, and pioneers became even braver after the War of 1812, and foot traffic began to increase substantially out our way. But when Isaac Shelby and Andrew Jackson pinned their names to the treaty with the Chickasaw Nation, the Jackson Purchase was added to the Commonwealth of Kentucky, and then the large southern section became part of West Tennessee. Our land was surveyed in sections and in townships based upon the Land Ordinance of 1785. But across the state, we were and are a crossroads for people traveling north and south and east and west. And as Frankfort became the capital, we began to see a real cross-pollination of not only customs, but very much our menu selections. Food items such as burgoo and pickles and things like coleslaw and baked potato, things like barbecue and the popular food items of Kentucky, even though we think of them as very much just a basic Kentucky menu, but they each come from different parts of the world. And so it's fascinating to dig a little bit into that and learn where these foodways have come from. We take a lot of our food items from the Native American food preparation, particularly. Many regional recipes came from early Indians and their ways of preparing foods. The new settlers, of course, brought their own foodways, food items, and their preparation techniques with them, but they also had their slaves. And the slaves had food items and preparation ways and techniques that they brought to us as well. So each group brought its own ideas of what plants were edible, how they should be prepared, how to procure them in many cases, and even how to preserve them. The Indian tribes of Shawnee, Chickasaw, Cherokee, and Creek were the first people to eat and serve foods such as bear, deer, and elk, turkey, buffalo, things that were readily available to them. They knew which nuts were edible. They knew which fruits were good and tasty, and also which greens were available and which would be good to eat. And they also had domesticated plants such as pumpkin and corn and beans and squash. They were the ones who really had understood how to grow those and to prepare them. So we also learned, and this was probably one of the best things I learned in this process of studying about foodways, that we learned a lot about the smoking of food from the native populations. The Indians taught the early explorers and the long hunters that went further west about hunting and cooking in their ways. Our barbecue roots they really began with Native American techniques. They smoked fish and game to preserve the food for when they had for the winter months to carry them through to spring. And of course, when the first Europeans came to North America, they also brought smoking techniques from Europe and Central Asia and combined those with what the Indian techniques were. And I can't prove this, but we really are suspecting that the smoking techniques that were used for food were also used to smoke tobacco. It's the same kind of technique, and we've really never been able to establish how did our farmers here in Western Kentucky learn to smoke tobacco in the barns like we do, because it is a technique that's not done anywhere else in the world. So it's kind of special to our part of the country. Many of our early pioneers were, of course, great hunters, great marksmen, and fishermen. They were adventurous and were out in the wilderness for months, sometimes years on end. So they had to know how to not only kill their food and clean it, but prepare it. So they had to have been pretty good cooks on their own. But as Kentucky became more settled and the fear of Indian raids subsided, we began to see more migration from other parts of the world. An aspect of our state that is very well known across the world is our livestock. Of course, our horse industry, the equine industry, is a pretty significant one, but we're also known for cattle and for sheep. And of course, in Western Kentucky, we have a high number of hog production, chicken, as well as goats. And so all of the livestock for Kentucky has been a primary ag industry for ever since our settlement. Of course, as you move through the state, the Cumberland Plateau is a fine place for apples and peaches and more of the fruit crops. And of course, the Jackson Purchase, where we have the fertile plains and the cypress swamps and creeks and rivers, we are known for all of the fish and the wild fowl that are abundant in this part of the state. And that's where we get a lot of our menu items as well. I did think it was funny, and I thought you'd get a kick out of this. It didn't take a smart Kentucky woman very long to come up with a cookbook. And the first Kentucky cookbook that I've been able to establish was from 1839. So very early on in our state's establishment. Lettice Bryan was the woman's name, and she was from Boyle County, Kentucky. And she put her recipes together and put them into book format. And amazingly enough, you can still find this to purchase on the internet if you're interested. I wanted to share with you a map today that many of you are probably familiar with since you studied the state so in depth. But I thought this was really a fascinating visual to show how the immigration patterns really impacted the state. I'm sure you can see from just the layout of the colors that, of course, the Irish and English and German are primarily the those who have remained in, or that who remained early on in the state. And the Scotch Irish, while there were thousands of them that came through, very few actually remained in Kentucky, which really surprised me. But Fulton and Callaway County do have a smidge of Scotch Irish, and actually that is some of my personal ancestry as well on my mother's side. But I just thought this was an interesting, and I'm happy to share these slides with you after the fact. If you're interested, I'll be glad to send the presentation or specific slides to you. I'm going to start with the German ancestry and what they really bring to us. For our family, when our immigrants came from Germany and then over from North Carolina to Kentucky, they were bringing their tobacco seeds. That was their primary way of making a living. And I didn't know if you'd seen tobacco seeds before, but I wanted you to understand how tiny they are. They're much like a mustard seed. And of course, in the early days, we would use these seeds to set out a plant bed to start the plants from seed. Today, that's not even done anymore. They're grown in nurseries, so you just go and buy your plants already in plant form. But in those early days, it was quite different. And of course, we brought our foodways with us. Pork was a big part of our diet. And it was early on, cabbages and potatoes, things that could be grown in a garden. And those were the food items that the Germans brought. They also brought their Christian faith of St. Nicholas and the Easter Bunny. But the religion was also a very big part of the heritage that they brought with them. The Irish and Scotch Irish are another sect of people that came through, and more than 250,000 Scotsmen immigrated to America from the Presbyterian colonies in the 18th century. And Ireland was torn and in horrible poverty, causing hordes of families to leave and make their way to America. And many of those people landed in Pennsylvania and then made the trek southward down the valley trails of Virginia and into the hollows of the Cumberlands. And some of them did settle in Kentucky. A lot of the Irish particularly did settle in Kentucky, particularly the eastern, and well, really all across the state. But they felt it was the best place for poor men, which I thought was an interesting way to say it. They were clannish, very independent, and the Scots meshed their traditions with the Irish and the Indian traditions, and then we have new foodways because of these traditions. Apparently, this group of both the Scottish and the Irish heritage really were the ones who mastered use of corn. Corn had been around, it was brought in, originally corn was from South America and made its way northward. But the Irish really learned how to master and use corn in a multitude of ways, and for anything from porridge or pancakes and breads. The corn was a staple of life, not just for humans, but also for animals. And so it was a really important commodity for farm families. They also learned how to take corn and things like milk and make it into something else. Just as they did with the corn, they did that with the milk. And they were beginning to ship butter. By 1800, butter was being made and then shipped downriver to New Orleans and then out to the West Indies. So very smart people that knew how to make other things with the commodities they had on hand. Another thing that corn, as we know today, is a popular product in Kentucky is, of course, whiskey. The Scottish and the Irish people were known for corn whiskey, but in Scotland and Ireland, when they were doing home distillation with grain, they were making it from rye. But as they come to Kentucky, they began to experiment with other grains. And from the rye, they go to corn, which then creates a different tasting beverage from their old world malt whiskeys. And demand was pretty good even then. So back in the earliest days, particularly after the American Revolution, the Pennsylvania farmers could not keep up with demand. So Kentucky farmers started growing corn to help them meet that demand. And that became a huge crop for Kentucky. Back in the day when distilleries were around, before they've been legalized as of now as well, but a farmer could produce 80 gallons of sour mash whiskey from an acre of corn. So sometime in the early 19th century, the tradition of aging the whiskey in charred oak barrels got started. And this followed European traditions. They had done that in the mother country, but here, that was when they began making bourbon. And it soon became the standard by which all American whiskey would be judged. It's interesting, the name bourbon for the liquid that's produced from this distillation process, they don't really know where the name came from, but Michael Veach is an author and a historian from Louisville. And he says that he thinks the whiskey was called bourbon because it was shipped out from New Orleans from Bourbon Street as a major port. So that's where he thinks the name bourbon came from. We also get a lot of our techniques and food ways from the English as well as other world countries. The English firmly impacted our food ways. They had a 1,000-year tradition of setting up towns with farms around them. And that was how our American layout ended up looking as well. For the most part, most of our early settlement, of course, occurred along riverbanks and creeks and that type of thing. But as towns became settled, the farms usually surrounded them. And the English were familiar with farming grains and meat. They had dairy and fruit and vegetables, and they had a lot of their own techniques to preserve foods that would take them from the plenty of summer into fall and through the time of need from winter into spring. So even though their immigration numbers are smaller, the French, Italian, and Greek and Chinese, those migration populations, as well as the slaves that were brought into America, all of these cultures were brought here and have given us a lot of food that we have today. And a handful of those, just for instance, okra, a shrimp creole, creme brulee, rice. I mean, those were food products that were brought to us from other cultures. Every culture, no matter what part of the world they lived in, had a difficult time keeping food fresh and preserving food so that you had enough to last through the difficult months of winter. Many folks would store their fresh milk or meat either in a cool spring, maybe that was a creek nearby, or maybe down in a well. Some families would dig cellars underground, sometimes under a porch. While others that might live close to town could perhaps purchase manufactured ice, it was always a challenge trying to keep food fresh. Water was another commodity that was really a lot of manual labor to obtain until modern technology made it more convenient. It's hard to imagine trying to make a pot of coffee in the morning. You know, you'd have to take a bucket and go to the creek, go to the well and bring in the water and then heat up your fire and wait till it boiled. I mean, it was a real chore just to prepare food. Cisterns were often used to collect rainwater just so that you had fresh water. And while measures were taken to purify it with, using charcoal or sulfur, typhoid was a real problem, and it was rooted from contaminated wells or spring water sources that were not healthy. So water was always a really important aspect of our foodways as well. The rural existence of farm families is really governed by the changing of seasons. And I get tickled about this part because my granny was so noted about looking for how thick a squirrel's fur was, or how he was collecting his nuts to prepare for winter. I know for myself in August or September, I start looking for woolly worms to see what kind of stripes they have on their back. But farmers looked for the signs of the moon and where the stars are located to decide on planting. And one of my favorites that Granny used to talk about was for every fog there is in August, there will be a snow in the winter. So living off the land really taught you to look at nature and let it guide your decisions. Most farm families work all year to have food, to create food, produce it, harvest it, and store it. And I think about families. My granddad on my mom's side he was one of 12, and I think about having to make clothes for that many, to have food for that many. I just, I can't even imagine trying to feed a family of that size. But everybody participated, and you definitely had a large garden, and you worked alongside your neighbors. You maybe coordinated with your neighbors so that if you were processing beef, you maybe couldn't store it for very long. So you would share with your neighbor. And then when their time came for them to process beef, they'd share back with you. And it was so, these were all aspects of being prepared, having food, and keeping your sustenance up throughout the year. Venison and squirrel, rabbit and turkey were tasty additions to the livestock fare that a farm might have. And then not to forget, the fish and fowl. I mean, bird hunting was a big deal, and still is in Western Kentucky, as is fishing. And I know we've had a lot of problems with the Asian carp, but hopefully they're beginning to turn a corner on that with the work that's going on now to try to eradicate it. Fresh vegetables are, of course, a big part of every farm. And even now, a lot of people are growing gardens again. But basically, most every farm family would have corn and beans, tomatoes and potatoes, cabbage and broccoli, and all the different variety of staples for a family to get their nutrition. And I remember as a child, we would spend hours breaking beans or shucking corn and all of those things that even today when I do them, I remember what an important, that was time consuming back then, because everything we did all summer long revolved around growing that garden and putting up the benefits of it. For some families, having a lot of farms do have fruit trees. I know Granny had grapevines growing at her farm. And a lot of farms have either apple or peach or pear trees, and they may have strawberries or blueberries or blackberries. All of these things can be canned and preserved and dried for winter use. I know my great-grandmother used to lay out sheets or anything across the yard, any flat surface she could find when she was drying apples. And she would can, and she would even can sausage. So, any food that could be canned or dried, they did it so that they had something to keep them through the winter months. Speaking of her, this is my great-grandmother, and my last book was a tribute to her. And I was telling Bruce the other day, this was not probably my greatest work as an author, but it was a book my dad wanted me to do because his grandmother, my great-grandmother, we all just adored her. And she was just a simple woman, but she really taught us a lot from her ways. And probably the one thing that I talked most about with her was she grew chickens. She raised chickens. They would be delivered by the postman. And their little baby chicks would come in the mail, and she would set them in the kitchen until they got in a cardboard box. She'd usually put them close to the refrigerator so they get the heat from underneath from the motor. And as soon as they were big enough to go out into the barnyard, she'd turn them loose or the hen house. But she, in her early years, of course, she used the eggs to trade for, she'd make either homemade butter or her eggs. And she would go to the general store, and that was her cash. That's how she exchanged her goods for other items that she needed. And so I think that's something fun for children to learn about. It's such an unusual thing for them to know because that's certainly not the way we do things today. Another aspect that's not something we see much of anymore, I know there's still a few farms that are doing this, but not many, and that's hog killings. And when I was getting into all of this years ago, Daddy when he would talk about hog killings, his eyes would light up and he would get so excited. But it was a big deal as a child to go to a hog killing because it was a social event. Neighbors would come together, and it was usually around Thanksgiving or the colder part of fall, getting on into winter. And the neighbors would come together to process the pork, but it was entertaining for them. It was a chance to be with your buddies and They would spend the afternoons together, and it was just a lot of fun. But it also provided the food that would carry them through the winter months. And then besides the meat that they were producing, they were also obtaining the fat, which would then be used for frying or baking. Of course, it made into lard, but they also made soap out of it. So a number of uses. And for our family, and I'll be curious to know from you all, we had a lot of pork when I was growing up, and chicken, and we had goat or mutton several times a year, and of course turkey and ham and those kinds of things. But I had never had lamb, and I never had thought about that until just the last few years. I never ate lamb at the farm, and so I'm just curious. We had goat, but I never had lamb, so I'm curious how that was for you guys if you grew up in the Western Kentucky culture. I mentioned a while ago about preserving foods. Of course, canning and drying foods was a tremendous aspect of a real growth opportunity. And I was surprised to learn that canning actually began at the time of the Civil War. And it was done, of course, to feed the Army across the country. And then after the war ended, the Cooperative Extension Service was part of the Federal Department of Agriculture, and they really helped to accelerate and improve home canning practices. So it became a real opportunity for people to have, for the first time, a solid and healthy way to preserve their foods. And then after World War I, and again during the Great Depression, there was a tremendous interest in growing and preserving foods. And all of that, again, was done through the canning process. But then after electricity came in, and people were able to freeze food, and then, of course, supermarkets became a popular new industry. And so food could be processed all year round. And so some of these practices of canning and preserving had kind of filtered out. It's interesting because of the pandemic. I know last year in the fall, my sister-in-law and some cousins were calling asking if I could try to buy canning jars and lids here in the Louisville area, because everywhere they were going, the groceries and Walmarts had sold out of those items. Because food supply had been interrupted, and they were concerned about getting through these winter months and trying to can and preserve as much as they could to make sure there was enough food for this year. So it's interesting how some of those old traditions have come back. Pickling is another process that comes from other cultures. And I thought it was really interesting. Pickling actually began, thousands of years ago. It's even talked about in the Bible. So it certainly was something. Pickles themselves are a product of India. And then the pickling process was something that was learned in ancient cultures. Curing meat is something that Western Kentucky is certainly noted for. We cure anything from meat, fish, and vegetables, and all of that also goes back to ancient days, both in the form of smoked and salt-cured meats. It was discovered in the 1800s that salt mixed with nitrates or saltpeter would color meats red. And at the time, of course, meat was gray and not very appealing in how it looked to consumers. They certainly preferred the red color. And so that's the way businesses now prepare and serve raw foods to be served and to be cooked. In our family, ham was most often cured in salt and then smoked with hickory wood seasoning. But many families also cure their ham in sugar, which is delicious, but it is different than how I had grown up with it. I get tickled when I talk about seasoning because, we had seasoning on the farm. We had dill and cinnamon and, the typical things that most families have, salt and pepper, but we didn't have a wide variety. Really, we had very simple things. But when we talked about seasoning food, it was not so much with spices. We were seasoning it with cured pork. Or lard rather than with the spice. So a lot of times, when we fix, a pot of green beans, we were going to put an onion and some ham hock in it. And that's how we season it. So every family has a different way of how they season their foods. And certainly there's a wide variety of seasonings available now to purchase. as I mentioned earlier, trying to, just boil a pot of coffee or get a pot of coffee going. I mean, I feel sorry for the cooks before there was electricity, because it was such a process to cook a meal, especially no matter what size of family you were preparing for. It was still a challenge. The men would get up and go out and gather up wood, bring it in and start a fire. You'd have to wait till it got really going to heat things up, and the kids get up and get ready, go do their chores and take care of the animals outside. And it might take an hour to prepare the food. But they usually had a big meal for breakfast because there was a hard day of labor ahead on most farms. For our family, coming together, as I said at the very beginning, Sunday dinner, and dinner is what we call the noonday meal. Supper is the evening meal. But it was certainly a big part of my heritage too. And I wanted to mention this too. Our family on my dad's side, the men would always eat first on Sunday dinner, and the children could also eat early, but the women always ate second. And I always thought that was strange, because on my mother's side of the family, they were French and Scotch-Irish, and they didn't do it that way. So it's just funny how the different cultures had a different way of even how they served the meal. For us, the dinner, in any dinner, was usually a fairly large meal, and then supper was lighter. And but there was always a meat and some type of vegetable and bread and dessert. It was always a full meal. Something else about cooking that I thought was interesting, I call it cooking by sight, but another author, her name was Marian Flexner, calls it cooking by ear. But it means that even though we know how to cook, but we watch somebody else do it, and that's how we learned. In the early days, before there were standardized measurements, women or cooks would just use their hands, like a handful or a pinch or a shake of, or any of those terms. But over time, of course, standardized measurements did come into play, and so now it's a pretty easy thing to follow a direction. I noticed in my granny's handwritten recipes, she does have measurements on most of them, but she has no instructions. It doesn't tell you how to make it. It just tells you the ingredients. And for her, and that's how I watched. I was, in her kitchen watching her or watching my mom, and that's how I learned how to cook as well. So I am not a good baker. I can certainly cook, but you have to measure things really well to be a good baker. So I've never been a very good baker. Speaking of baking, I've learned as I've done this presentation over the state that everybody has their favorite kind of bread, whether it's cornbread or biscuits. Some people like their cornbread with yellow meal, some like it with white, some like it with an egg, some like it without an egg. Everybody has their own way. But regardless, most everybody likes something on their bread, whether it's butter or some type of a jam or jelly. But bread is certainly still a very popular piece of our meal functions. As food has become such an integral part of our lives, there's a great deal of it that centers around traditions. Typically holiday traditions. And those are memory makers. These are the things that, as you think back on your past, oftentimes it will be around events, particularly the holidays. I know in my parents' generation, they talk about, for them, it was a big deal at Christmas to get an orange and some Brazil nuts in their stocking. At Christmas, it was just that was a very special treat for them as a farm child. For myself, I know birthdays were always special, having a birthday cake just for you, and with candles and that type of thing. And anytime I've been asked what I want for birthday meal, I always want fried chicken. That's always been my favorite. And of course, that's probably the most complicated in the older days, particularly it was the most complicated to prepare, but it was always my favorite. And then as I've heard from other people, we never had chicken and dumplings when I was growing up. But a lot of people had that rather than fried chicken. So again, it's just whatever your culture is what comes about. Food was often used as a way to raise money for special causes. Cake walks and box suppers or pie suppers were usually hosted by or held for either a church or a religious organization or maybe a school. And it was often so that they could raise money to buy supplies or equipment. Local musicians would often contribute their talents to such events and join in. Of course, there were moonlight parties and barn dances, but they all centered around some function of food as a part of it. Our family also celebrated the holidays like Memorial Day, Labor Day, 4th of July. Those holidays were also really a special time because the farmers, they would maybe work that morning, but take off the afternoon or at least during the meal time so that you could join together with your family. And we had a family reunion every 4th of July. I mean, up until I was in my 20s, until all of the older generation died out. But those were such special times, and the food was, I mean, everybody, every family brought a picnic basket full of food and set it out on a flatbed wagon. And, it was just a time for being together and for celebrating with one another. It was all a part of being a family. Another farm tradition is the matter of feeding the farm hands. And I want to tell about two things here. The first is about the bell on the bottom of the slide there. In the old days, before we had cell phones and this type of thing, my great-grandparents farmed, and of course, the one with the chickens a while ago, Mama Brewer. And when Papa was working in a field that was too far from the house for her voice to carry to him to let him know it was time for dinner, she would ring the dinner bell, and that was how he knew to come to the house. And that's certainly a tradition that has been lost today, but certainly brings back a lot of memories. And that actually is me and my mom on the back of the pickup truck there with my sister-in-law, closer to on the left side. But we were taking food to the field for the men on a Saturday. And, for them, it was just a sandwich probably and some iced tea. But anytime the men were working in the field on up until the 80s, probably, we took food to the field. And I think that's very different today than it was back before all things, modern food choices have changed with McDonald's and so many places offering prepared foods now. When you think about fun food activities, I just jotted down a few that popped into my mind, but growing up, I remember going on some frog gigging trips, and I do still love fried frog legs. They're one of my favorites as well. But just, picking blackberries or shelling beans, those were things you did with people that you loved, and it was a time to share stories and sing and just be together. My granddad there with his bird dog, he raised bird dogs, and of course going squirrel hunting or bird hunting was always a big part. Deer hunting still is a big part of our family's heritage. Making snow cream. I haven't had a good batch of snow cream for several years now because we haven't had any big snows, but hopefully we'll have at least one good snow before winter's over. And then, of course, there's so many festivals that are centered around foods. We have Tater Day over in nearby Benton because of the sweet potatoes that were such a big product for that community. The Ham Festival in Cadiz and the Banana Festival over in Fulton. So just, food items are really center part of even the festivals that we have organized over the years. So cooking is a part of a family's tradition. It is part of our family's culture and heritage, and I'm sure it is part of yours as well. For me, it's really about family and about service. In researching my family's history, I discovered some pretty simple truths. Food is what nurtures us physically, but there's an emotional bond that somehow grabs us and stays with us throughout our lives. And by capturing this heritage in food, I've found a way to honor my elders and their enduring legacy for me. My papa was an excellent cook. He grew up he was one of 12 and he had 6 sisters. And when I think he was 14, he fell off a horse and broke his hip and had to be in bed for, 6 months, I think. Several months anyway, I don't remember the exact time, but in that time, his sisters did not want to wait on him, so they taught him how to cook and how to sew. And we have a quilt that he has a block that he quilted in the quilt. And he could sew beautifully. And so I'm just honored to share his legacy. And I mean, he is so much a part of me and I am part of him. And so when I think about these food products and how that has transcended the generations, it's something that I really am excited to share. And I want to encourage each of you, if you have not written about your food ways before, if you look back at your own family pictures, and oftentimes the pictures will be a prompt for me in my writing. I'll see something in the picture that will remind me of an activity or an event that occurred, or I'll see, like with Pepaw, he had a cast iron skillet that I inherited, and that my husband is there on the left at the bottom holding that cast iron skillet with our bread in it. And so it's just something that, that cast iron skillet has a real special meaning to me, even though it's such a utilitarian item. But it, again, is part of that food culture. But as you look at your pictures, by the way, if you haven't written on the back who they are, please do that, because I've got a basket full of pictures that are so wonderful, but I have no idea who the people are. And I'll also encourage you to please tell your family stories to your next generations. I know a lot of times they don't want to hear it and they're not interested. I guess that's why I write as much as I do. I hope someday they'll read it if they don't want to hear about it. But try to pass on these stories to the next generation. If we don't continue to tell them, they're never going to know what life was like before electricity, or before we had indoor toilets, or before we had the internet or an iPhone. So sharing the traditions of your recipes, and most of all, the stories that go along with them, the people who made those delicious meals. It's just a really big and important part of who we are. And with that, I will stop and try to answer any questions that you have. I just appreciate this opportunity to be with you.